So I would say that the Lower East Side is kind of known for being like an eclectic, like artsy neighborhood. It's pretty much the vibe of the neighborhood nowadays, at least. Now, was it always like that? So it definitely was not always like that. So it was a completely different neighborhood back in the day. We're gonna go over some of that history in this video. Back in the mid-19th century, there was like a wave of immigrants coming over from Europe and landing in the Lower East Side. That was like the place that they started to go. So a lot of these immigrants were coming specifically from Eastern and Southern Europe. And because so many people were migrating over to this area in New York City, it became very, very overpopulated. So a lot of these immigrants were living in tenement buildings. Now, this might be a little familiar because there's also, to this day, a tenement building museum in the Lower East Side. So that is a nod to like the history of what was once the Lower East Side. But anyway, these buildings became extremely overcrowded because so many people are migrating here and all living in these buildings. And because of this also, so it kind of like spilled over to the streets as well. Like there was a lot of like activity on the streets compared to other neighborhoods. So over time, there was a lot going on here. It was like a community for like Yiddish theaters. There was a lot of like political activism taking place in the Lower East Side too. So it really was becoming very, very like cultured. So around the early 20th century time, so most of those people who migrated over to this neighborhood, or like the families that did at least, were then starting to move outside of New York City. So from there, you saw a lot of people migrating from the Lower East Side to like the surrounding suburbs around New York City. So now to jump to the late 20th century. So around this time period, there was actually a lot of like demolitions that were done in this neighborhood to all of those historic buildings that all of these immigrants moved to when first coming here. So that's when like there was a whole urban renewal process that was really taking place in this neighborhood. And this is where it started to really, really change. It's kind of crazy because now like where some of these former like tenement buildings were, they're now luxury apartments. So like the whole neighborhood is completely different than what it used to be. And there's been a lot of like commotion about this, both good and bad, because some people love that the city has come such a long way, and this neighborhood particularly. So some people are saying that the new construction kind of overcame what once was Lower East Side. And you can kind of see both sides to this argument. Now the neighborhood has tons of like trendy dining spots and like nightlife, so it's very, very, very different than it ever was before. So what are some famous spots in the Lower East Side, and what's some of the history behind them? So first off, just like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the Tenement Museum. Now this is actually housed in an old tenement building, which is actually really cool because you're like truly getting a feel for what it was like. So the whole purpose of this museum is to give you a feel for what it was like for immigrants coming here to the Lower East Side. So then you have the Eldridge Street Synagogue. Now this was built in the late 19th century, so it's basically one of the few structures left of like the Eastern European Jewish community, especially in this neighborhood. Now Orchard Street actually once had a pushcart market on the street, and it was kind of like a big hub for like local shopping in the neighborhood. So Rachel's Tombstone is another piece of history in the Lower East Side. So it is actually a like resting place for Jewish immigrants who came over to the Lower East Side. So then you have the Seward Park Library. It was built in the early 20th century, and it really, really is an amazing piece of architecture. And this library particularly was definitely like a movement that was happening in the Lower East Side when this was built. So those are just some historic places in the Lower East Side. So I would love to hear from you guys in the comments if you have anything to add about the Lower East Side's history. And as always, I just love hearing from you guys.